Personally, I did not grow up in a household that held any guns. That's just not how my parents never felt like they needed to have any guns for their own safety because we lived in a very suburban neighborhood. They had no need to protect us really other than the locks on the doors. They didn't think that was necessary.
So I'm from New Zealand, and in New Zealand we have very strict gun control rules, and this means that the first time I actually saw a gun was in the United States, and that was a very scary moment for me because I hadn't understood that guns were a major part of society until I walked into a fast food restaurant and there was a random security guard with a gun.
I know that my grandfather lives in Texas, which is a stand your ground state, which means that if someone comes on your property and is breaking into your house, you have the right to use a gun to steer them away from your property. The biggest issue that comes with that law, though, is that if you shoot someone while they're retreating or shoot someone while they're running, you face major issues with the law. But because of the stories my grandfather's told me about the 3 or 4 times that his house has been attempted to be broken into, I do think that gun control is something that we need to ease up on a little bit. And I think that when you're trying to, disarm people who actually need guns to protect their homes in certain areas of the country, you make them more vulnerable when you try to take guns away from them. And that's not to say that there shouldn't be more background checks. That's not to say that it shouldn't be harder to get a gun. But there are, like my grandfather, some people who really, really do need a gun to be able to protect themselves.
I was saying, me personally, both my grandparents are farmers in South Africa, and I've been around guns since a very early age, and I think that's helped me to learn to respect the rifle or the shotgun or whatever. And I think that perhaps they shouldn't be around unsupervised, but children should definitely learn how to fire a weapon and how to just use it and be safe around it, and just basic gun safety.
I wouldn't say that I'm someone who's studied the statistics or logistics of regulation of guns or background checks. But I certainly think that the ideas of, or the mentalities that we've taken in terms of, or the majority seems to have taken in trying to not really do anything about it and really just focusing on, I think some keywords that have been brought up have been mental health, trying to focus in on mentally disturbed people. I think, well, that's certainly a way to go. An expansion of an understanding on mental health is, I don't think people will say is a bad thing. But I think there's a lot of room for regulation on guns, certainly. I think that, frankly, it's ridiculous it's ridiculous how easy it would be for me to get a gun. For example, if my father went to a gun show, and let's say he left the gun very open at my house or at our house, and I just decided for one reason or another that I wanted to pick up the gun and take it with me somewhere, it'd be incredibly easy.
The most exposure that I think children really should have to guns is just, at the very most, a controlled firing range environment, but where everyone is very closely watching over them, and I'm talking maybe 10 years old. I remember being around guns and doing that sort of thing at maybe 10, but just having a child play with a gun, even an empty gun, that gives the child a wrong idea of the magnitude of guns.
So on the question of should children be around guns, I think it's definitely a yes, because I feel like if you are not around guns from a young age, you're not going to understand how to respect them.
In 2010, there were 600 or more accidental deaths from guns, and the majority of those involved children under the age of 15, usually self-inflicted or as the perpetrator.
So there's been a lot of talk recently, and I know the head of the NRA has come out in support of putting armed guards in all of our country's schools. And I think at some level, you certainly want to have some degree of protection in schools, but at the same time, in the past, where school resource officers, that's what they're calling them, have been implemented, the school resource officers have been used to sort of escalate, perhaps racially or otherwise, against schools. There was a video a couple months ago about a school resource officer coming in and pulling a girl out of her chair because she was being a little bit combative in class. And to that extent, putting police officers or other armed guards in schools doesn't seem very effective. As well, I think we need to think about fiscal costs and the impact of requiring someone who you're paying $50 or $60K a year simply to put in your school to protect it versus the likelihood that a school shooting will happen.
I believe that guns should not be around children. They should be around responsible adults who have undergone serious background checks in order to determine whether or not they are able to have the responsibility of owning a gun. There should not be any discrimination against any race or religion that tries to purchase a gun. I believe that gun laws should be applied to everyone, not necessarily a specific group or minority.
I think that I'm one of the few people who, while being a gun supporter, is also one who supports increased background checks. And I know that there are, plenty of stories out there that show that background checks aren't worthwhile because A, they're ineffective, and 2, they're very overexpensive. But nonetheless, I think that that's a system that we can enhance and improve, especially with the evolving uses of money in the economy. I think that the government, while increasing money on military spending and whatnot, will be able to put a bit more money into the background checks, and I think that the FBI can contribute to this as well. I'm confident that people like my grandfather who do think they need a gun to survive would pass the background check. And although it may be a bit more of an inconvenience, I think that all people who own a gun legally should have no problem with being background checked if they have nothing to hide. Although it may be a bit more of an inconvenience, I think that it should be no problem, seeing as they could be saving the lives of thousands of Americans just by, taking the time out of their day to go through a bit of an inconvenience.
Yeah. I think that people who have had a history of mental illness, not like depression or anything, or actually maybe depression in some cases, but people who've had a history of serious mental illness or who show like an inability to sympathize with others or think about the consequences of their actions should at the least have much stricter regulations in terms of owning guns, if not barring them from owning guns completely. In addition, I think that people who have murdered someone before, who have a serious felony, should also be barred from owning guns, or people who have proven ties to gangs should also be barred from owning guns.
Well, I think that there's certainly a reason behind why background checks exist, why background checks are there. I don't think that everyone should have a gun, just like everyone shouldn't be, or isn't, let's say, qualified to join the military for whatever, let's say, health reasons. I think the same thing one could look at in terms of guns. If you're going to be holding something that has the potential to take someone's life away, surely that's not something that you can give to anyone. Surely that's not a right so much as a privilege, I would say. Some can bring into mind some that are mentally healthy, so to speak. Some can bring into mind, obviously, very young people, and that's why there's sort of age restrictions on guns. And that makes sense to me. I mean, certainly you don't want someone who's, shall we say, immature, who's thinking about things in a certain way that's not logical, but driven by, let's say, depression, driven by a mental illness. You don't want to have sort of a variable like that with something as dangerous and as serious as a gun, I'd say.
Agree, the background check should give you information about family and give you information about children's health records, both mentally and physically, to really determine standards for who gets to be around a gun. If you look what happened in Connecticut a couple years ago, that woman Nancy Lanza, whose son Adam Lanza used her gun in the Newtown school shooting, should not have owned a gun. Nancy Lanza should not have owned a gun because the background checks that I'm supporting should be funded enough that they get so extensive that they can see what's wrong with the kids. If you have a son who's mentally unstable, you should not be able to own a gun, and I stand by that. There is also a certain degree to which the law is unable to touch a family. And when talking about whether or not children should be around guns, I think that's an aspect you really can't control. What we can control is whether mentally healthy children are the ones around guns. And I think that's an aspect that will come along with background checks and will prevent people like Adam Lanza from getting guns in their hands from their parents' gun closet. Now, I do understand that it might be unhealthy for perfectly mentally healthy 5- and 7-year-olds to be around guns, but nonetheless, that's a household choice, and that's one that the government can't control.
But at the very least, you need to make sure that that person has not had any mental breakdowns in the past, has not had any violent incidents, and that they go through a proper gun training course so that they can understand the gravity of holding a dangerous firearm.
I don't think it's a big issue at all that people want background checks, and I really do think that they need to be increased. Because like I said earlier, if you have nothing to hide and you're truly using a gun to protect yourself, then the background check should be no issue for you.
Mostly when we talk about gun safety, people talk about the right to defend your home and that the people who use them in massacres could be stopped if only more people had guns. But the fact that the majority of gun deaths don't actually happen in massacres, and that for every one legitimate use of gun in self-defense or defense of property, there are about 4 accidental
I
deaths.
think there's a huge difference to be recognized between clearly why the U.S. has outlawed or made illegal automatic machine guns to the common people versus pistols and rifles and shotguns, etc., and all the other differences, like rocket launchers for crying out loud. But I think that you sort of need to have a restriction in terms of what guns are available to people. I think this goes back to the sort of idealistic versus practical argument about what is the role of guns. Again, idealistically, we shouldn't really need guns, but practically speaking, they're sort of there. So keeping the fact that they're sort of there in mind, if you can avoid really dangerous guns that sort of serve no purpose besides, or rather have a higher potential of danger than any real practical reason behind them, realistically you try to sort of ban that.
I think that different types of guns should certainly have different types of regulations. I don't think that an assault rifle should be as loosely regulated as a pistol should. I remember I've mentioned my grandfather several times who owns two pistols in his house. He would never dare buy an assault rifle, and even as someone who is willing to fight to keep his guns, he knows that an assault rifle is not necessary. And this goes back to the Newtown shooting. There's no need for someone who's 18 to 21 years old to be able to carry a semi-automatic military-grade rifle. There's just no need for it. So I do think that there should be higher regulations, and I think that the background check should get more and more complex, as not necessarily the caliber of the weapon, because I know that can change pretty variably, but I'd say as the firing power or as the automatic nature of the weapon increases. I think that it should be easier to get a pistol than it should be to get an M16, and I think that within each class of guns there should be more regulations. Not every pistol is equally as powerful. You shouldn't be, checked the same amount if you want to get a tiny little Beretta pistol versus a Desert Eagle. I think that there are varying levels to all of the background checks.
So on the topic of should different types of guns have different regulations, I think yes, there should be different regulations. So for instance, I don't think anyone needs to have an RPG, as you've seen in Chicago. There's some pictures of people who have RPGs. But on the other hand, I do think that these decisions need to be made through data instead of through emotions. So for instance, it's something around greater than 90% of gun-related murders are through handguns. But it's very easy to get a handgun, but it's almost impossible for someone to get an assault rifle, which also happens to not be a real term. So I think, yes, there should be different regulations, and perhaps no automatic rifles, for instance. But I do think this needs to be made on data instead of just made on emotional levels.
Regulate things along those lines. I mean, guns are going to be there because they're going to be there. But if you can sort of prevent really dangerous weapons from getting into common people's hands, or just, I think the fact that they're really dangerous weapons to begin with, I think would be the reason that you'd want to regulate that in the first place. For example, to me, magazines that are, for example, the magazines that were used in Sandy Hook that were 30 plus bullets and up, I think is ridiculous to me. I don't see any reason for that. I don't see any justification as to why that should be legal on the market for pistols.
You have to be careful with gun regulations, making sure that you don't anger gun lobbyists or gun enthusiasts, because if you do that, then there's a high chance that they will try and I'm making them sound like crazy people, but they're not crazy people. It's just when the government tells you you can't do something, it's very within human nature to say, well, I'm going to do that and I'm going to stockpile more guns just for myself. And then if you have a crazy person who somehow stockpiled a lot of guns, that can result in a very unfortunate situation. And
banning guns or to ban other devices like that will certainly not necessarily help people that would be following those laws, and would benefit those that have more malicious intent and are not afraid to sort of acquire something even if it is illegal.
and I think it was 11 malicious shootings, shows that they're not as useful for self-defense as they are for actually inflicting harm. Moreover, the majority of attacks when they're used to attack people aren't just random shooting sprees where someone can defend themselves. It's actually in domestic abuse, etc. And there was a statistic, I think it was, women who live in a household with a gun are 5 times more likely to die if they are being abused than women who live in a household without a gun. And so I believe that yes, there should be stricter regulations about guns. These would be helpful, as you can see already in other countries like in New Zealand, like in Australia, which actually initially had a gun culture quite similar to the United States until there was a massive school shooting and they decided to have harsh gun controls, and now guns are basically out of society there. So yes, I believe regulations should happen and they would be very helpful.
I think that there should be more regulation on guns. I think that there needs to be more of a consideration of all the tragedies that have come more and more, especially as of recently, and to not really do something about it. It's sort of going back to something that Einstein once said, or Einstein's definition of insanity, which is sort of doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. I think the same idea can be applied here, sort of letting the same thing happen over and over again and doing nothing about it and expecting at some point it just won't happen again. I think it's ridiculous. I think people need to realize that something has to be done. This isn't a passive problem with a passive solution. There has to be an active solution.
I think that yes, further regulations will be able to reduce gun violence, but I also think that there needs to be a cultural shift in America. So, for instance, we have a very, very heterogeneous society, and actually recently, in terms of like warfare, not warfare, but like tensions between different groups have risen. I think there was some graph I saw recently that said something like, in terms of like race relations, people think that these are the same like levels of badness as they were in the 1990s during the crack epidemic, and also there's I just think there needs to be a concerted effort to both have regulations on the most dangerous types of weapons, but also there needs to be like bringing communities together and making it so that people feel like so that they can work together and they feel like they respect one another and they don't have to fire weapons to get their point across.
I think the role that guns play in our society is pretty complicated, and it's one that gets more complicated with every day with evolving technology and with the evolving uses for guns.
Well, I think you have to sort of answer that question from a practical and from an idealistic way. And to start off, first off, in terms of idealistically speaking, guns should really have no place in common society. There's little reason for them. There's little positive use for them. If anything, I can only see common civilians or common people only using them for, at best, recreational uses, and at worst, frankly, violent uses. That's not to say that everyone misuses guns, but I don't see how, like, if we could avoid guns having a place in society, again, this is idealistically speaking, then that would be the best. Practically speaking, you can't really get rid of guns in the sense that we have them today. I mean, unless you could get some sort of over-grasping government taking away everyone's guns and the typical cliche you think of, there's really nothing to be done about it. Practically speaking, guns should be controlled, should be more regulated, but you ultimately can't take them away from people.
I think to some extent guns are a certain evil, not only in the world, but in society as well. Like before guns, you certainly had swords or other weapons, but it was a much more intimate experience to kill someone. With a gun, especially with something with a longer range, it's very, very easy to cause a great deal of harm. And to that extent, the guns are horrible, but I think we must admit that they're sort of here, and they're here to stay.
The right question to ask might be, how do you reduce violence in the United States, not gun violence? Because violence is what we're trying to avoid, and like the fact that it comes from a gun is not necessarily the most important part of that. But guns do make it a lot easier to perpetrate violence very quickly, and so if you reduce the holding of guns by people who should not be holding guns, you can certainly reduce violence.
So yeah, the last thing I'd like to say on the topic of guns is that I've heard a lot of people saying that there should be like a federal gun registry, and some people even saying that should be public. And I think there's a few key reasons why we should not have a federal gun registry, especially when it's public. So firstly, if it's public, I think it makes it a lot easier for criminals to target individuals that don't have guns. Well, if you know that your neighborhood is typically armed, then a robber or whatever is less likely to invade your home. But if it's a public registry, people are likely, they can look it up and they can then say, I'm going to target this home because I know that they don't have weapons. Secondly, I think that, and obviously this sounds like a crazy idea, but in the past when there are these types of registering or, like having it be on a federal file, that it's much more easy for the government to persecute people, individuals like that. And I'd like to say that America is completely like free of those types of things, but this has definitely happened in democratic societies before. Like for instance, the Weimar Republic, they started persecuting people based on their national religious beliefs. And then even in the U.S., in 2010, I believe, there was the whole Tea Party IRS tax scandal. So I think that we need to be vigilant against having a federal public registry of weapons.
Fathers wrote and see that what's written as a right really ends up being more of a privilege, or really ends up being more, or ended up being more of a privilege. And I think that you can certainly push that into today. I mean, I don't think everyone has the right to bear arms, so to speak. I don't think everyone can just be casually given that on the basis of a document that, well, I'm not going to say that the Constitution is irrelevant or is tarnishable on a document that's frankly not always contextually relevant in today's day and age, in terms of all the things that it leaves out, in terms of all the things that have changed throughout the years. I think that there's definitely, I would say, I think that the interpretation of the Second Amendment can sometimes be too loose, certainly.
I heard Senator Marco Rubio in a debate a couple months ago say the Constitution is a document that, no matter how old it is, cannot be touched and cannot be changed. And if you're going to stand by that, then the Second Amendment can't be changed. The right to bear arms will stand, and that's just something that I accept. Regardless of any political affiliation, I think that Rubio is right. I think that the Constitution does remain untouched, but nonetheless, no presidential candidate disagrees with the ability to add amendments on. And if that's what needs to be done to make guns safe in the world of evolving technology, then I'm totally for that. And I think that Republicans and Democrats alike will tell you that if people are dying at the hands of guns because they're too loosely checked, then background checks need to be increased. And regardless of what that does with the Second Amendment, we're not getting rid of the Second Amendment, and we're not making any ridiculously large changes to the Constitution. But amendments can add or subtract from other amendments. And I think that if another amendment needs to be added to make the Second Amendment a bit more strict, then that needs to be done. In a general sense, I just think that in addition to background checks being increased, there needs to be a bit more social literacy around guns. And in some states, not necessarily all southern states, but you do have people who start taking police matters into their own hands because of their access to guns. You see the people in South Texas who think it's their job to defend the border against illegal immigrants from coming in because the Border Patrol is not doing an adequate enough job. So, background checks can't measure intentions. And I think that there just needs to be more social literacy concerning the issue of guns, that people don't feel motivated to take police matters into their own hands. Guns should be used for defense. They should not be used for attacks. We have a strong army, we have a strong police force, strong National Guard, strong Border Patrol for that. They can be defended against people breaking into your house, and they can add a sense of stability to a household, and I understand that. So A, I'm for increased background checks, although I am in major support of every American having the right to bear arms. And B, I'm for more social literacy concerning guns. Regardless of what that may take, I think it needs to get done. And I don't think that there's any legislation that can get social literacy concerning guns. But I do think that if you get a stronger background check system, people are going to generally realize what a privilege it is to own a weapon. And because of that, I think that people are going to be a lot more careful and a lot more responsible with them.